In this other video, we had started to customize the default design system that was created with the KB and used Unanimo Web. Here we'll delete what we had done and make more interesting customizations. We'll start by looking at the differences between the work with panel that GeneXus created and our first imitation of that panel, the one we had created from scratch. The work with filtered the attractions with this field using the like operator. It didn't implement the filter in the grid conditions, but in the general conditions of the web panel. We, on the other hand, filtered according to a range, and that's why we had these two variables. We're going to create an attraction name variable to replace one of the range variables. We change this one for the new one, delete the other one, move this one to the right of the country filter, delete this table, and now we modify the conditions of the grid filter to use the same like operator as in the work with. Let's try it. That's fine, but our field looks less attractive than the one in the work with. Why is it different? Let's compare the properties of both fields. Here we see those of our field, and here those of the work with. Let's copy them to ours. This is the text that appears in gray inside the field before the user types anything. We no longer need the label. And here's the most important one, the class. Let's associate this very specific class with it. Presumably, it's the one that controls its appearance. Let's try it. And look at the class properties. The design system object that controls the design is this one, which is importing Unanimo Web. And there we look for the name of the class. Here it is. It has all these properties. For example, the one that controls the border color, the rounded tips of the border, the search image, the background color of the field, but also note that it includes another class, that is, its properties. Among others, we can see those related to the font, its family and size, and for example, the field width, which is 100% in relation to its container, which in this case is the cell of the table where our field is located. Why is it here below this other control, and when the screen is enlarged, it appears to the right, seemingly taking up 50% of the screen? The control is located in the right cell of this row, of this table, the main table. When a new web panel is created, its layout is always initialized with the table, the main table. Every control that's inserted will be inside that table, and any other control that's inserted will automatically create another cell of the table. Here the table ended up with 2 cells, and if we insert another control, we'll have 1 more cell. This is a special table known as a responsive table. Here we see that the table containing all our controls is responsive and has this property, responsive sizes. What does it indicate? The 4 cells of the table with the controls that go in each one. For example, here's this control, here's this one, then the grid, and finally this variable. They take 100% of the available width and are displayed one on top of the other, as if it were a table with a single column. If we look at this combo, size, it says that this is valid for the extra small screen size, which is the same as that of a phone. However, note that there are 3 other possible screen sizes. For the extra small size, the 2 cells of the first row shown in layout will be displayed one on top of the other. Each one is taking 100% of the table width. That's why at runtime, the variables for that size were shown like that. If now we select the medium size, which is the desktop size, row 1 of the table will be effectively displayed in one row, where each cell will take up 50% of the table width, as we saw at runtime. We can modify that width here according to these 12 options. And so, for example, set attraction name to take up 75% of the table width. But for both fields to be in the same row, we'll also have to change the width of this other one so that it takes up 25%. The large size that follows it inherits the value of the medium size we've just set, and therefore looks the same. Let's test this change at runtime. We refresh, and here we see that change in the widths of each field. 25% and 75% of the table width. These percentages continue to be kept as we reduce the screen size, going through the small size that we haven't modified, and up to the extra small screen size, where the width of each control in row 1 was 100%. Variations by size can also be seen by pressing F12 in the browser. Here it allows us to vary in a discrete way, and here in a continuous way. What we've seen so far is that we can vary the width and place of the controls of a responsive table according to 4 screen widths: extra small, small, medium, and large. Now let's take a look at our grid and compare it with that of the work width. First of all, our grid has a white background. It doesn't take 100% of the table width, and it'll load all the tourist attractions. Meanwhile, the work with grid also has a white background, but it does take up the entire width and allows paging, loading 10 at a time. We see that the work with grid has this associated class, and the number of rows per page is set to 10. In this case, the grid class is the default one. We'll change it for that of the work with, and set the number of rows per page to 10. Now it takes the entire width and does paging. Let's inspect the class properties. Here we see why it now takes 100% of its container's width, which in this case is this cell on the second row of the main table, so it matches the table's width. Also, the background color configured is the one that comes from this color token, which, from what we saw at runtime, is white. We do not have it defined in this DSO, but we do have it in this other one that's imported by Unanimo Web. Here we see the white color. If we want to change the background color for all the grids that have this class defined, for example for this one, or for a new alternative color that we'll have to define, then in our applications DSO, the one that we can customize, we select the class that we want to customize and overwrite only the value of the background color property, assigning it now the value of the alternative token, a new one that we'll have to define here, because it doesn't exist in the tree of imported DSOs. So we add it as a color token So we'll be able to reuse this color token as an alternative background for all the classes we want. Let's try it. We press Ctrl F5. And we see it applied to both grids. Where does this white color with rounded edges come from in the work with? And with this spacing in relation to the grid? Here we see that the grid with the class we've just customized is inside a table. This one, which has this other class associated with it. This appearance must be configured here. We're going to look for it to the UnanimaWeb DSO. Here's the spacing property, padding. It indicates that the content of the control that has this class must be spaced in relation to the control's borders in this magnitude, given by this token, which will be in pixels. In addition, this class includes this other one, that is to say, its properties. Here we see the background color, that of the surface token, which was white, and both the property for the rounded edges and for this shadow that you see. Now note another interesting thing. While for the work with grid, we press F12, there are columns that are no longer displayed when the screen width decreases. And only the attraction name and the actions remain. This is not the case for our grid. All of them are displayed, even if they don't fit well. Why? The reason is that these columns have associated classes that determine whether or not they are displayed according to the screen size. Thus, the ID column has two classes, so the properties of both will be applied. The one named column, which is also in the attraction name column, but it also has this other one, which is repeated for all the columns that were hidden for the small screen size. Those of the actions, not coincidentally, do not have that class. Let's look for the class. Here we find it with the display property set to none. But if we look closely, this class is being defined in this way only when this rule applies. It's the one that allows conditioning the output to a maximum screen width of 767 pixels. If the screen size is bigger, this definition is not valid. Actually, since this is the only occurrence of this class in this Styles tab, it means that for any other screen size, there are no properties for the class. That's why, in that case, we see the columns displayed on the screen. In our grid, let's add this property to the columns that we don't want to be displayed in the small size. We generate. Before refreshing, all the columns are shown. On the other hand, once we refresh, the ones we've just worked with are only displayed when the screen width is greater than 767 pixels. We can continue to look into the differences between our grid and the work with grid to understand how to standardize the design. To understand better how to style our controls, let's examine the variable we have in our panel. Suppose we want to change the color of the label, which is highlighted in black, and have the variable's contents also appear in a different color and set against a different background color. Variables by default are input variables in web panels. We changed it to read-only, but let's change it back to the default value for a moment. Let's run the build, and, meanwhile, note it has the attribute class associated with it. If we look at it, we see all these properties configured. We run, refresh, font family, font size, padding left and right, border color, color, background color, border radius. All of this is being configured, the variable field. And where's everything related to the label configured? In another class, one that sets the label style. And how do we tell this class that the one that controls the design of the label is that other one? Through this GeneXus property. Here we're indicating that the class named attribute label is the one that sets the style of the label. Let's look for it. For example, here we see the font in semi-bold, the text aligned to the left, and with padding of 4 pixels in relation to the upper border of the cell where the control is located. Let's copy both classes to our DSO and make changes. We could modify these here, but that would affect all the controls that have them as classes. It's better to create special classes to customize our special use case that will correspond to a highlighted attribute or variable. Let's create then a highlight attribute class. Let's copy all these properties of the attribute and that of the label class. We'll call it in this way. Let's comment out the attribute class that we won't modify at all and select the new one to style the label. In addition, let's copy the properties of this other one. Now let's make changes, for example, to the colors, and align the text of the label to the right. Let's save the DSO. And now we change our variable's class to the new one. And run it. We see all the changes. What will the variable look like if we now change it to read-only? In the properties of the predefined attribute class, we can see it has this property, GX read-only class, which is defining part of the style when this attribute class is applied to an attribute or variable that's read-only. That is to say, if it's not read-only, this property will not have any effect on the control, but if it is, then to the properties of the attribute class, the properties of this other one will be added to determine the style, overriding those that are repeated. Here we see that everything in the attribute class is included, but these properties are overwritten, and this other one is added. Let's copy the class to our DSO so we can see it. Let's add to our highlight attribute class the property that will indicate the class when the attribute or variable control is read-only. We give it this name, and here we define it. We can include the highlight attribute class to secure the shared properties and modify and or add the ones we want. For example, let's copy these. The padding left and right is removed. We leave it at 0 and overwrite the color and background color. Let's try it. We refresh and see how these properties are now being applied. We clean the DSO. In short, the highlight attribute class will always apply to the variable, but when it's read-only, this other one also applies, so it's not really necessary to include the first class in the second one. Now let's make the following change. Let's set the blue color and pink background when the control is read-only, and use instead what comes predefined in the attribute class in Unanimo Web for the class in general, overriding these two properties because we want to apply our two classes in those cases. Let's try it at runtime. Our variable is read-only, so now we see it in pink and blue. And if we now make it non-read-only, it takes the style of the attribute class, but with the style of our class label. One last thing. To see what properties are being applied in the CSS that controls the appearance of this HTML, since we had pressed F12, we can inspect the elements of the HTML and its appearance. Here we have the element corresponding to the label, and see this class with the properties. We can remove this property and see how the label stops aligning to the right. The same with padding top. Note how it changes depending on whether or not we have it. The same happens with the color. And if we now look for the input control itself, it has the highlight attribute class with all these properties. Let's try to remove the padding right and the border radius. In this video, we wanted to complete a small sample of the technical aspects related to adding a style to the user interface, using as an example the customization of the design system of Unánimo for Web, a predefined design system. But of course, we could create a design system completely from scratch. As you may have noticed, most of the properties of the classes we're working with are identical to the CSS properties. In addition, there are some that are specific to GeneXus. There's an entire world to discover that only requires you to know that GeneXus controls and which properties to use in the design system. We encourage you to continue exploring.